You see this? We have a confirmed love square after this week's episode of Shigatsu. This week's episode of Shigatsu pretty much focuses on Tsubaki as a character, and we get some more characterization for her, and I'm glad this episode took the time to actually develop her romance, her feelings, the feels, the childhood past, and her relationship with Kosei. I'm glad it took the time to develop her character. That's exactly what this episode was. Besides the ending of setting up for the recital with Kosei, I will get into that in just a moment, but that's pretty much what this episode was focused on. Now, I want to talk about the entire romance aspect first before I dive into the events with Kosei at the end of the episode. Okay, Tsubaki. This episode, I'm quite shocked to see how many feelings she has towards our main male character. I mean, it was hinted at that she was kind of jelly last week. I mean, she's been kind of jealous and stuff. But with this week's episode, we get the full, broad perspective of how she really feels. How Tsubaki feels about Kosei being with Kaori. So we get to see the overall front of how she feels and the repercussions of what is currently going on. The main issue of this episode is that she has a lot of relationships with Kosei. For instance, she had a very deep childhood friend relationship in the past with him, and she's just now really starting to realize that she actually has feelings for him. She used to have him all the time to herself, and she really did not realize this until just recently, after, Kosei was starting to play the piano once again with another girl, for instance, Kaori, and she finally realized how big of a distance they are between each other. For instance, he's so vastly far off in a different world pretty much from her, and, he's currently with someone else. So you have it to where Tsubaki in this episode is pretty much very jelly in this episode of how pretty much Kaori is taking up all the time with Kosei. Now, one thing I will say though, just because she's really jelly, I actually feel very bad for her. I really do. I'm actually growing some form of emotions for her character. Honestly, last week I didn't really care about overall her perspective and her feelings towards Kosei. I didn't, because she really just didn't feel that right to me when compared to Kosei with, Kaori. But with this week's episode, it's really hard for me to say that I would not ship, Kosei and Tsubaki, because they actually seem to go together quite well too, because of the childhood flashback we saw in this week's episode. For instance, right at the beginning of the episode, we see Tsubaki carrying our main male character, Kosei, on her back, and his leg is hurt, and her leg is hurt too, but she continues to walk to carry him to, back home. And after this entire ordeal, after all these events in this episode with the drama build up and her losing the game because of getting affected by being jealous towards Kaori and Kosei, she loses, the game. But in this entire event, as it progresses, she hurts her foot, and you have it to where Kosei realizes this, kicks her a little bit in the leg. She's like, oh! And Kosei carries her home. That entire scene was very adorable, and I love the way this episode ends. It, begins with, Tsubaki carrying, Kosei, and then it ends with Kosei carrying Tsubaki. That was a beautiful ending to this episode. I will say right now, that was a great way to end this episode off. Even though it didn't exactly end at that point, it was a great point to end the episode off, especially when it came to the feels, the emotions, and the romance. Now, let's dive into the other aspects of this episode. For one thing you could get from this episode besides the ending is that Kaori has pretty much wiped the dust off of Kosei's piano. At his house, he had this piano that he used to play all the time. It has a bunch of dust that's collecting on top of it along with books, and he tried to hide this piano. That's pretty much what he tried to do. He tried to hide it, but he still wanted to have some form of attachment to it, and as he buried it, pretty much the dust, everything collected on top of it. But you had it to where, there was some form of symbolism with how Kaori came in and knocked the dust off and pretty much unlocked Kosei's feelings to where he's starting to be able to play the piano again. You gotta love the symbolism in that scene. Now, the final conclusion of this episode, for the most part, I like the way it's going. For instance, Kosei is going to be having his recital, and most likely next week, and I'm very interested to see exactly where it's going to go, because you had a couple of pianists that have been playing for a long time, probably at the time when, Kosei was still a great pianist, and he was playing all the time when he was younger, and you have it to where these kids, or these people, grown-up teenagers now, are like, oh, I'll finally get to play with him again, and I'll definitely crush him. So, this is definitely going to be a very interesting challenge for the next week's episode, because Kosei's still trying to figure out how he wants to do music, what type of music he wants to do and stuff like that. He's just still trying to get a grasp on playing the piano again, and with these rivals coming in, I wonder exactly how they're going to react to him probably not being the same as he used to be. So, overall, episode hits you right in the feels. This episode was great. Animation, for the most part, was a lot better than last week's episode, but I will state this once again. It is still very jarring when you go from a comedy aspect art style to a serious slice-of-life drama-ish type art style. It's very jarring. Like I said last week, it's just very weird when you go from one art style to another, back and forth. But it didn't do that as much this week, so it's not as noticeable or as bad as it was last week. So tell me your thoughts in the comments below. You all have a wonderful day or not, wherever you live. Please be safe. Chibi out.